All right, so y'all go ahead and do the factoring and math knowledge question for today. Pause the video, and then once everyone is finished, you can unpause the video and I'll go over the correct answers. So for the factoring, you're going to multiply the 3 by 6 to remove it. So you'll have x squared plus 7x minus 18. And then when you go to factor, you're going to have 3x plus 9 and 3x minus 2. So the first one will divide by 3 to give you x plus 3. The second one will stay as it is, and you'll have this for your answer. For the math knowledge question, we want to know average speed in miles per hour. So our miles was 60, or miles were 60, and then the hours 1.5. So 60 divided by 1.5 gives you 40. So 40 miles per hour is your average speed. All right, so we're looking at lesson 39 today. We're looking at area under a curve. We're going to do upper and lower sums, and then we're going to look at left, right, and midpoint sums. So hopefully you'll understand how area under a curve works today. So we know a lot of different area formulas, but we don't know how to find the area of these figures because they've got a curved side. So the way that we're going to do that is to do upper, lower, left, right, and midpoint sums. And that's going to approximate it, and then in another couple of weeks we're going to figure out how to find them exactly using calculus. But we want to know how to approximate them after today. So the first step, if you have a graph, you want to partition the interval into non-overlapping parts, and you'll be told how many parts you need to make. So we start with a graph here. So to know how many parts you need to make, they'll tell you, but you're going to draw your vertical lines. And so this one, if we're going from 0 to 2, you'll see how we have 1, 2, 3, 4. That would be if they told us n equals 4. We would want to have 4 parts. So you'll draw vertical lines depending on how many pieces you're supposed to have. For step 3, you're going to draw rectangles. If you're supposed to have a lower sum, your rectangles need to be below the curve. If you're supposed to have an upper sum, your rectangles are going to be above the curve. So it'll just depend on what they're asking you to find. And then from there, you'll find the area of your rectangles and add them together. So for this one, we want to use lower sums to estimate the area under the curve of y equals x squared plus 2. So that's a parabola that starts at the origin 2 above it, and then it's going to increase. And so I'm leaving a lot of space here so that we have 1 and 3. We can actually draw our rectangles in there. So we want it to be 4 equal subdivisions. So I'll split it in half and then split it in half again. So we need to figure out what our x values are here. So halfway between 1 and 3 is 2, and then halfway between that is 3 halves, and halfway over here is 5 halves. So that would be your x values for each one. Now we want to do our lower sums. So I'm going to use red. We need to be below. So that would be making this rectangle here, this rectangle here, a rectangle here, and a rectangle here. So we are going to have 4 rectangles because they said n equals 4. And then we're going to find the area of each of them. So you can use this little formula here if you're wanting to find the length of each rectangle. On these, the difference between 1 and 3 halves, or 3 halves and 2, the difference on all of them is 1 half. But you can confirm that by using this formula. A is 1, B is 3. You always go from A to B, and then our n is 4. So 3 minus 1 over 4 is 2 over 4, which is 1/2. So if you're not sure, you can use that little formula to figure it out. So the length down here of the rectangle, the base, is 1/2, and the base on each of our rectangles is 1/2. So all of them are going to be multiplied by 1/2. And then we just need to find the height of each of them. So the height is going to be going from here to this point right here. And so we're going to plug in 1 into our equation. So if we plug in 1, 1 squared plus 2 is 3. And then you're going to find the next one. So its height is going to be found by plugging in 3/2, because that height is going to be right there. So 3/2 squared is 9 over 4 plus 2 is going to be 17 over 4. Okay, the next one we're going to plug in 2, because that's where this height is going to come from, right there at that point. So 2 squared is 4 plus 2 is 6. The next one you're going to plug in is going to be 5 over 2, because we start here and we go up this far to get to our height for our rectangle. So 5 over 2 squared is 25 over 4, and then plus 2 is going to be 33 over 4. And so then we're going to add all of those together and then multiply it by 1/2 to get our area. So 3 plus 6 is 9. 33 over 4 plus 17 over 4 is 50 over 4, which reduces to 25 over 2. So then 25 over 2 plus 9 gives you 43 over 2. And then multiply it by 1/2, and that gives you 43 over 4 for your area. So that's an estimation for the area under the curve. Notice the parts that we are missing for our area are the parts right here, 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 and here. Okay, so it's not exact, it's just an estimation, but that's what we're working on right now. So we're looking at another one. We want to use upper rectangles to estimate the area under y equals negative x squared plus 9. And it says only on the interval from 1 to 2. So you need to graph it. So negative x squared plus 9 is going to be a parabola that starts up at 9 here, and then it's going to fall. And we're going from 1 to 2. And I know that's not to scale. That's okay. And we need to have 5 subintervals. So I'm going to have to make 5 rectangles in here. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So they're supposed to be all the same width. Now, I know mine don't exactly look like that, but that's okay. So we're going to do b minus a over n, and that gives us 1/5. So that's the same thing as 0.2. So this would be 1.2, and then 1.4, and then 1.6, and 1.8, and if you add again, you get to 2. So those are the lengths of each one. I'm going to go back real quickly on the previous one. Notice that we didn't use 3, because we don't have a rectangle with a height of 3. So over here, you're not always going to use all of the numbers that you have. So that's why it's important that you use the correct either upper, lower, left, right, midpoint, whatever it tells you, so that you get the right rectangles. So now this one says to use upper rectangles. So that means that they need to be above. So again, here's going to be a rectangle, and then here will be a rectangle because they've got to be above the curve. And so they're just barely above the curve until it starts being a little bit more noticeable. So these 5 dots that I just did are the ones that we're going to want to use for our x values to plug in to get our height. So for the area, the base length is 0.2 because that's what we found to be the length of each rectangle. So now we're going to plug in 1 into our equation because that's the first number we get, and we get 8. And then we're going to plug in 1.2. And if you plug in 1.2, you should get 7.56. The next number you're going to plug in is 1.4. And so you should get 7.04. And then you're going to plug in 1.6, which is going to give you 6.44. And then you're going to plug in 1.8, and that's going to give you 5.76. Again, we're not going to plug in 2 because we don't have a rectangle that starts over here. Don't plug in your 2. So then you're going to add those all together. So if you add those together, you should get 34.8. And then if you divide by 0.2, you get 6.96 for your answer. So that's how you do upper and lower rectangles. It is possible that you have a mixture of upper and lower depending on the problem, or that it looks a little bit different, that they won't all look the same. I guess you wouldn't have a mixture of upper and lower if it specifically asks you for upper and lower. Alright, so we want to use lower rectangles where our n equals 6 for the equation negative x squared plus 2x on the interval from 0 to 2. So on this one, I'm going to factor it, and I'm going to factor out a negative x, and so that's going to leave me with x minus 2. And so that means that I'm going to have a 0 at 0 and a 0 at 2. And it's a parabola. So that's more what it should look like. And we need 6. So I'm going to cut it in half, and then I'm going to put 3 on this side and 3 on this side. And it should be symmetric. Whether or not it looks symmetric is dependent on how well you can graph. So b minus a, 2 minus 0 over n, 6, gives you 2/6, which is 1/3. So from 0, this is going to be 1/3, and then this is going to be 2/3, 3/3, which is 1, and then 4/3, 5/3, and then 6/3 is 2. So there is the first part. Now this one says use lower rectangles. So if I draw a rectangle over here, for it to be, if I drew it this way, it would actually be above the curve, which is not what I want. So I have to draw it from this side, but then there's no height. So it's actually, like, we don't need that one. Okay, for this next one, we're going to draw it this direction to make our rectangle. And then we're going to draw it this way to make our rectangle. Now, if I drew it this direction, that would make it above the curve, which is not what I want. So I have to come from the other direction. And so there's going to be the rectangle, and these should actually be the same height because it's symmetric. And then on this one, it should be the exact same height as this one over here. So obviously didn't graph it that well. But there's your other rectangle. And then for this one, if I started here and I drew it, that would be above the curve, which is not what I want. So I have to come this way, so the height is 0. So again, I only have 1, 2, 3, 4 rectangles, even though it said n equals 6. And that is possible sometimes. You just have to be really careful how you draw it. Okay, so we're going to find our area. The length of each rectangle, the base length, is 1/3. So we're going to do 1/3, and then we need to find the area of this rectangle here. So the height that we're going to figure out is this here, which is where we're going to plug in 1/3. So if you plug in 1/3 here, you're going to get 5/9. And then for this next one, the height that you're going to use is 2/3 because that's where the point is. And if you plug in 2/3, you should get 8/9. And then we don't plug in 1 because we don't have a height that starts at 1, so we don't use it. If you plug in 4/3, that's going to be the height that you get from this rectangle right here. You're going to use 4/3. You should also get 8/9 because it's a parabola. These two are supposed to be the same size. And then for the last one, you're going to plug in 5/3 because that's the height you'll use. Then you should get 5/9. Okay, so if you add those together, you should get 26/9, and then if you multiply by a third, you should get 26/27. So that should be the area under that curve, or the estimation of the area under that curve. Okay, so let's look at using right rectangles instead of upper rectangles. So it said the one from 39.2. So that was y equals -x squared plus 9 on the interval from 1 to 2, where you have 5 rectangles. Okay, so we're going to start off by graphing. And we're going from 1 to 2. And I know it's not exactly to scale, that's okay. And we need to have 5 rectangles. I'll leave a little bit more room here. So there's 1 rectangle, 2, 3, 4, and here's the 5th one. So again, you can do b minus a over n, and that'll give you 1/5 for this one, or 0.2. So we're going to have 1.2, 1.4, 1.6, and 1.8 for our numbers. And it says use right rectangles. So when it says right rectangles, you're always going to start from the right. So here, 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 and here. Which on this one is actually lower rectangles. But we don't really care if it's lower. We just needed to do right rectangles. It is possible that you have a mixture of lower and upper whenever it says use left or right rectangles. So don't worry about whether they're upper or lower. You only pay attention to the right because that's what it asks you for. So the area on this one, the length down here is 0.2 because we found that the distance between them was 0.2. Over here. So now we're going to plug in, we're not going to plug in 1 because we don't have a dot there. We're going to plug in 1.2, and that would be 7.56. If you plug in 1.4, you're going to get 7.04. If you plug in 1.6, you get 6.44. If you plug in 1.8, you get 5.76. And then if you plug in 2, because we do get to use 2 on this one, you get 5. From here, you're going to add them together. And you should get 31.8. And then if you multiply by 0.2, you should get 6.36 for your area. So that's how you can use right rectangles. So now we're going to look at left rectangles. So we're going to do example 39.3 using left rectangles. So that said y equals -x squared plus 2x on the interval 0 to 2, with n equals 6. So that's the one where we factored, and it went from 0 to 2. Okay, so we divide it into 6 pieces. And then it says use lower rectangles. So all of the it says use left rectangles instead of lower. So all of the rectangles have to start from the left. So this one would go like that. There won't be a rectangle here. This one, we're going to start from the left side, from the left side, from the left. So some of them are lower and some of them are upper, and that's okay. So we don't have a rectangle here, but we have 5 of them total. So the area, the base length is 1/3, and then we're going to have to find the area of the 5 rectangles. So we're going to plug in 1/3, and so if you plug in 1/3, you're going to get 5/9. If you plug in 2/3, you get 8/9. If you plug in 1, you get 1. If you plug in 4/3, you get 8/9. And if you plug in 5/3, you get 5/9. Okay? And then you're going to add those together. And so that's going to be 35/9. So if you multiply by 1/3, you get 35/27. And so it gives you a different answer using left rectangles instead of lower rectangles. So you got to pay attention to what it asks for. Okay, so now we're going to look at one more, and it's dealing with midpoint rectangles. So we have y equals cosine of x from 0 to pi/2. So cosine hits a maximum at the origin, and we're going from 0 to pi/2. So that's pi/2, where it crosses the x-axis the first time. And we want to split it into 4 rectangles. So those are the 4 rectangles. So this would be pi/4, and then halfway between 0 and pi/4 would be pi/8, and then halfway between pi/4 and pi/2 would be 3pi/8. So those are your rectangles, but we want to use the midpoint. So this is the midpoint here. So here's your rectangle. Here's the midpoint for this one. So we don't actually care about the pi/8, pi/4, 3pi/8, or pi/2. We need the point that is where our dot is, which is the midpoint of all of those numbers. So halfway between 0 and pi/8 is going to be pi/16. Halfway between pi/8 and pi/4 is going to be 3pi/16. Just add them together and divide by 2. Halfway between the next ones are going to be 5pi/16, and then halfway between the next ones is 7pi/16. So our length is going to be from 0 to pi/8, so pi/8, and then we're going to use pi/16, 3pi/16, 5pi/16, and 7pi/16 in our calculator. So cosine of pi/16 plus cosine of 3pi/16 plus the cosine of 5pi/16 plus the cosine of 7pi/16. And so we're going to use our calculator to plug that in because we don't know what the cosine of those values is. So you need to make sure you're in radians. So I'm going to do pi/8 and then cosine of pi over 16. Oh no. And then plus cosine of 3 pi over 16. Make sure you're closing your parentheses for each cosine. Plus the cosine of 5 pi over 16. Plus the cosine of 7 pi over 16. And then close your parentheses and close the big parentheses. And you should get 1.0065 if you plugged it in correctly. So your answer should be 1.0065 for your answer. So that's how that works. Alrighty, so that's how you have to do left, right, midpoint sums, upper, lower. Make sure that you're doing the correct one that they ask for. That's the biggest thing. And that you use the right number of rectangles. Your homework tonight is 1 through 25, so make sure to do those tonight so that we can go over any questions you have tomorrow.